I have spent 42 years in rooms where the air does not move, where the cold is not just temperature but a presence that settles into your bones and stays there long after you've left. I have stood in fluorescent silence beside bodies that once held entire universes of memory, desire, and regret. I have watched families collapse in doorways. I have heard sounds that should not exist in places meant only for endings. And I have learned that death, despite everything we tell ourselves, is not always the final word. My name is Dr. Marcus Webb. I am 67 years old now, retired from a profession that does not leave you even when you leave it. I began my work in 1973 at Bellevue Hospital in New York City, where I learned that the dead speak in their own language if you know how to listen. I moved to the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office years later, where I witnessed the evolution of forensic science from rudimentary autopsy techniques to the sophisticated machinery of modern pathology. I have handled cases that made headlines and cases that disappeared into filing cabinets. I have stood over the bodies of celebrities and unknowns alike, and I can tell you with certainty that in that final moment, fame means nothing. We are all equal in the cold room. But there was one case, one impossible moment that I have carried with me through retirement like a stone in my chest. It happened during what should have been a routine viewing, a brief moment of closure for a grieving widow. What occurred in that room defied everything I understood about death, about the finality of the heart's last beat, about the boundary between what is and what cannot be. And it taught me something about truth, about the weight of secrets, about the things we carry in silence until silence is all we have left. Before we begin, if you find comfort in these late-night accounts from my years inside the morgue, you may want to stay close. More stories like this one tend to surface when you least expect them, and I hate for you to miss what comes next. So, if you wish to keep following these quiet journeys through the shadows of history, feel free to subscribe. And if this kind of story resonates with you, a simple like helps more than you know. Now, let's proceed. Let me take you back to that night. Close your eyes if you need to. Let the world outside fade for a moment. I want you to feel what I felt, to understand not just what happened, but what it meant. The morgue at the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office was never truly silent. There was always the hum of refrigeration units, the occasional drip of water from old pipes, the distant echo of footsteps in corridors that seemed to stretch into darkness. The smell was constant, a mixture of formaldehyde, industrial cleaning solutions, and something else, something organic and ancient that no amount of ventilation could remove. It was the smell of endings, of stories concluded, of final chapters written in flesh and bone. I had learned over the decades to find a certain peace in that environment. Not happiness, never that, but a kind of acceptance. I understood my role. I was the last witness, the final professional observer before the body was released to family, to funeral homes, to the earth or the fire. I documented. I measured. I cut and weighed and recorded. I turned the chaos of death into orderly reports that courts and insurance companies could process. It was methodical work, and I found comfort in that methodology. It kept the emotional weight at bay, or so I told myself. But every medical examiner, if they are honest, will admit that there are cases that break through those carefully constructed walls. Cases that refuse to remain clinical. Cases that follow you home, that wake you at 3 a.m, that change something fundamental in how you see the world. This was one of those cases. And it began, as so many do, with the simplest of procedures. A final viewing. A widow's last goodbye to her husband of 40 years. Nothing unusual. Nothing that should have shattered my understanding of what is possible in the space between life and death. And yet, the winter of 2009 was unusually cold in Los Angeles, a fact that seems almost symbolic now. The morgue was colder than usual, the refrigeration units working overtime, their mechanical breathing louder in the quiet hours after midnight when I often did my work. I preferred the late shift. Fewer interruptions. Fewer living people to navigate around. Just me and the dead and the steady rhythm of documentation that had become as natural to me as breathing. The deceased had been brought in 3 days earlier. Thomas Whitmore, aged 73, cause of death listed as myocardial infarction. Heart attack. Common. Expected at that age, especially given his medical history, which showed diabetes, hypertension, and a previous cardiac event 5 years prior. The autopsy had been routine, confirming what the attending physician had already documented. Natural causes. No signs of trauma. No suspicious circumstances. The kind of death that is, in the cold language of my profession, unremarkable. But death is never truly unremarkable to those left behind. His widow, Eleanor Whitmore, had requested a final viewing before the body was released to the funeral home. This was not unusual. Despite the clinical nature of the morgue, despite the reality of what happens to a body during autopsy, many families need that moment, that last look, that final goodbye. I always tried to prepare the body as carefully as possible for these viewings, to preserve some dignity, some semblance of the person they had known. Eleanor had arrived at 7:30 in the evening, accompanied by a younger woman I assumed was her daughter. I met them in the family room, a space we had created to be as unlike the rest of the morgue as possible. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs, tissues placed discreetly on side tables, photographs on the walls showing peaceful landscapes, oceans, forests, anything to provide a visual escape from the knowledge of where we actually were. Eleanor was small, perhaps 5 feet tall, dressed in dark clothing that hung on her thin frame as if she had recently lost weight. Her face was lined not just with age, but with grief so fresh it seemed to radiate from her like heat. Her eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted. She held a small photograph in her hands, gripping it so tightly her knuckles were white. The daughter, whose name I learned was Catherine, stood close to her mother, one hand resting gently on Eleanor's shoulder, a gesture of support that spoke of long practice. I introduced myself, my voice low and measured, using the tone I had developed over decades of speaking to the bereaved. I explained what they would see, preparing them gently for the reality that the person in the viewing room would not look exactly as they remembered. The body had been through autopsy. It had been refrigerated. The spark that makes us recognize someone we love would be absent. I told them they could take as much time as they needed. I told them I would be just outside if they needed anything. I had given this speech hundreds of times. It was a ritual, a necessary bridge between the living world and the cold room. Eleanor nodded, barely listening. Her focus was entirely inward, or perhaps forward, toward the moment she would see her husband again. Catherine thanked me quietly, her voice steady but strained. I led them down the corridor, our footsteps echoing off tile floors, past doors that led to examination rooms, storage areas, offices filled with filing cabinets containing the documented evidence of thousands of deaths. The hallways seemed longer than usual that night, as if the building itself was reluctant to deliver them to their destination. The viewing room was small, designed to accommodate one body on a gurney and a handful of family members. I had prepared Thomas Whitmore as carefully as I could. The autopsy incisions were concealed beneath a sheet drawn up to his chest. His face had been cleaned, his hair combed. His features, in the fluorescent light, were peaceful, settled into the final expression that death had chosen for him. His eyes were closed, his hands folded over his chest, covered by the sheet. It was the best I could do. I opened the door and stepped aside, allowing Eleanor and Catherine to enter first. Eleanor moved forward slowly, as if walking through water, each step requiring enormous effort. When she reached the gurney, She stopped, her entire body seeming to contract around a pain so intense I could almost feel it radiating from her. She reached out with one trembling hand and touched her husband's face, her fingers gentle, tentative, as if she feared disturbing him. I stepped back into the corridor, giving them privacy, but I left the door slightly ajar, as was protocol. I could hear Eleanor's soft crying, Catherine's murmured words of comfort. It was a sound I had heard countless times, the sound of love confronting loss, of the living trying to communicate with the dead across an unbridgeable distance. I stood in the hallway, waiting, giving them the time they needed, my mind already moving ahead to the paperwork I would need to complete, the phone call to the funeral home, the next case waiting in the refrigeration unit. 10 minutes passed. 15. I heard Catherine suggest gently that perhaps it was time to go, that they could come back tomorrow if Eleanor needed more time. I heard Eleanor's response, barely audible, saying she needed just a few more minutes alone with him. I heard Catherine agree, heard her footsteps approaching the door. She stepped out into the corridor, her eyes wet, and asked if it would be all right if her mother had a few minutes alone. I nodded, told her it was fine, that there was no rush. Catherine walked a short distance down the corridor, ostensibly to compose herself, though I suspected she simply wanted to give her mother complete privacy for those final moments. I remained near the door, respectful of Eleanor's solitude but present in case I was needed. The building was quiet around us. The refrigeration units hummed their constant mechanical song. The air was still and cold and heavy with the weight of all the deaths this place had witnessed. Then I heard Eleanor's voice, speaking softly to her husband. I could not make out the words, but the tone was intimate, tender, the voice of someone sharing private thoughts with a beloved companion. This was not unusual. Many people spoke to the dead during these viewings, saying the things they had not been able to say before, seeking some final connection, some last communication. I stood quietly, not listening intentionally but unable to completely avoid hearing the soft murmur of her voice. She was saying something about their life together, about memories they had shared, about the house they had lived in, about their children. The words were fragmented, broken by tears, but the love in her voice was unmistakable. She was telling him goodbye. She was releasing him. She was trying to find closure in a moment that offers no true closure, only the beginning of a different kind of pain. Then her voice changed. The soft, tear-filled murmur became something else. Something sharp. Something that carried a note of shock so profound it pulled me immediately to full alertness. I heard her gasp, heard movement in the room, heard her voice say, "Tom? Tom, can you hear me?" I moved toward the door instantly, my professional instincts overriding everything else. The widow was speaking to her dead husband as if expecting a response, and in my experience, this sometimes indicated the beginning of a psychological crisis, a moment where grief overwhelmed rational understanding. I needed to be there, to provide support, to gently guide her back to reality if necessary. I pushed the door open and stepped into the room. Eleanor was leaning over the gurney, both hands now on her husband's face, her body trembling. She was staring at him with an expression I had never seen before in all my years of handling viewings, an expression that was equal parts hope and terror. "Dr. Webb," she said, her voice shaking, not taking her eyes off her husband's face. His eyes. They moved. I saw them move. I approached the gurney immediately, my mind already running through the possibilities. Post-mortem muscle contractions. Optical illusion caused by grief and exhaustion. The play of light and shadow creating the appearance of movement. But even as I thought these things, even as I prepared to offer gentle reassurance, I looked down at Thomas Whitmore's face and felt something shift in the cold room. His eyelids were still closed. His features were still settled in that final peace. But there was something different, something I could not immediately identify, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up despite 4 decades of professional conditioning. "Mrs. Whitmore," I said carefully, keeping my voice calm, "it's not unusual for the bereaved to perceive movement. The mind, in grief, sometimes creates what it needs to see. I can assure you that your husband is at peace." But even as I spoke these words, even as I reached out to gently guide Eleanor back from the gurney, I saw it myself. The slightest flutter beneath his eyelids. So subtle it could have been a trick of the fluorescent light. So brief it could have been imagined. But I saw it. And in that moment, I felt the foundation of my understanding begin to crack. Eleanor saw the change in my expression. She gripped my arm, her fingers surprisingly strong. "You saw it too," she whispered. "Tell me you saw it too." I wanted to deny it. I wanted to offer a rational explanation. But I had built my career on observation, on trusting what my eyes told me, on documenting reality no matter how uncomfortable. And I had seen something. Something impossible. "Let me examine him," I said, my voice steady despite the unease spreading through my chest. I moved closer to the body, my fingers automatically reaching for the carotid artery, checking for a pulse even though I knew with absolute certainty that this man had been dead for 3 days. His body had been autopsied. His organs had been removed, weighed, sectioned, replaced. His chest cavity had been opened and closed. There was no possibility of life, no possibility of consciousness, no possibility of any neural activity whatsoever. My fingers found no pulse. The skin was cold under my touch, refrigerated flesh that had long since lost any warmth. I checked his pupils, lifting one eyelid carefully, expecting to see the fixed, dilated pupil of death. Instead, I saw his eye move. Not the passive movement of an eye being manipulated. Not the random drift that sometimes occurs in recently deceased individuals, but a deliberate, focused movement. His eye tracked my face. It looked at me. And in that impossible moment, I felt seen by the dead in a way I had never experienced in 42 years of working among them. I released his eyelid immediately, stepping back, my heart pounding despite my professional training. This was not possible. This was not medically, scientifically, rationally possible. Yet I had seen it. Eleanor had seen it. And as we stood there in the cold room, staring at the body of Thomas Whitmore, I felt the boundaries of my understanding begin to dissolve. Eleanor's voice came again, quieter now, filled with a strange mixture of fear and tenderness. "Tom, if you can hear me, please try. I need to know." And then, in a voice that should not exist, that could not exist, that violated every law of physiology and death that I had studied and practiced for 4 decades, Thomas Whitmore spoke. The sound was barely audible, a whisper that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside his chest, a sound that bypassed his immobile vocal cords and emerged anyway, defying everything. The words were unclear at first, just breath and intention, but Eleanor leaned closer, her ear near his mouth, and I saw her face transform as she heard what he was saying. She straightened slowly, her hand covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face, but these were different tears. Not grief alone, but something more complex. Shock, understanding, a pain that went deeper than loss. "What did he say?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, not sure I wanted to know, not sure I could handle knowing, but unable to stop myself from asking. Eleanor looked at me, her eyes wide, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 40 years of marriage, 40 years of shared life, 40 years of truth and lies woven together so tightly they had become indistinguishable. "He said he's sorry," she whispered. "He said he's so sorry. And he said a name. He said Sarah." The room seemed to contract around us. The fluorescent lights flickered once, briefly, then steadied. The humming of the refrigeration unit seemed to grow louder, filling the space with mechanical breath. And I understood, in that moment, that I was witnessing something that would change everything I thought I knew about death, about truth, about the secrets we carry in the moments when those secrets refuse to remain buried. Because Thomas Whitmore, 3 days dead, autopsied and prepared for burial, had opened his eyes in his wife's presence and spoken a name that clearly meant something profound and terrible. And I, Dr. Marcus Webb, retired medical examiner who thought he had seen everything death could offer, was about to learn that the dead do not always keep their secrets, and that some confessions wait for the very edge of forever before they finally surface into the light. I need to tell you something about the morgue that you cannot understand unless you have worked in one for decades. It is not just a place where dead bodies are stored and examined. It is not just a building with refrigeration units and autopsy tables and filing cabinets. The morgue is a repository of endings, yes, but it is also a place where truths accumulate, where the lies we tell while alive are stripped away by the clinical process of examination. The body does not lie. The organs tell their stories. The tissues reveal their secrets. Blood toxicology exposes what was consumed. Fracture patterns indicate what was endured. The dead, in their silence, speak more honestly than most of the living ever do. I had learned to listen to that honesty over the course of my career. I had learned to read the stories written in flesh and bone. A woman found in her apartment, dead for 3 days, with marks on her wrists that told of restraints, of captivity, of a death that was not the suicide it was initially reported to be. A child brought in with injuries attributed to a fall, but the pattern of fractures, the stages of healing, the evidence hidden beneath skin, all speaking of systematic abuse that had finally resulted in death. A young man in his 20s, athletic and healthy, dead from sudden cardiac arrest, but the autopsy revealing a previously undiagnosed congenital heart defect that had been ticking like a bomb inside his chest since birth. These were the truths the morgue revealed. These were the secrets that could not survive the methodical process of examination. And I had come to believe, over the years, that death was the great equalizer not just of social status but of truth itself. That in death, finally, we could not hide what we had been, what we had done, what we had suffered or inflicted. But I had also learned something else, something that took years to understand fully. The morgue attracted not just bodies but grief. It accumulated sorrow the way old buildings accumulate dust, in layers, in corners, in spaces between the visible and the acknowledged. The families who came to identify bodies, to say goodbye, to sign paperwork and make arrangements, they left something behind. Their pain soaked into the walls. Their tears seemed to linger in the air. Their whispered goodbyes echoed in corridors long after they had gone. I had handled cases that broke me in ways I did not expect. The young mother who died in childbirth, her newborn surviving, her husband standing in the viewing room holding their baby while looking at his wife's body, trying to process grief and joy simultaneously. The elderly couple who died within hours of each other, married for 62 years, and their children insisting they be laid out together for viewing, holding hands, because they could not imagine them separated even in death. The teenager killed in a car accident, his parents unable to accept that their son was gone, bringing his favorite music, his favorite shirt, asking if I could dress him in it, as if the familiar clothing might somehow bring him back. These cases taught me that death is not just a biological process. It is also an emotional event, a psychological rupture, a moment when the fabric of existence tears and we are forced to confront the fundamental impermanence of everything we love. And I learned to hold that knowledge carefully, to maintain my professional distance while also honoring the human reality of loss. But there were nights, many nights over the decades, when I would stand in the empty morgue after everyone else had gone home, and I would feel the weight of all those accumulated griefs pressing down on me. I would hear sounds that could not be explained by building mechanics or temperature fluctuations. Soft crying from empty rooms. Footsteps in corridors where no one walked. The sound of a door closing when all the doors were open. The smell of perfume or cologne that had no source, fleeting and familiar, as if someone long gone had passed briefly through the space. I told myself these were the products of exhaustion, of too many hours in a place saturated with death, of a mind trying to make sense of sensory input in an environment where the normal rules of human experience did not apply. I did not believe in ghosts. I did not believe in hauntings. I believed in empirical evidence, in scientific methodology, in the measurable and the verifiable. But belief and experience are not always aligned. And there were moments, accumulating over the years, that challenged my comfortable rationalism. The filing cabinet I found open one morning, its drawers pulled on in sequence, displaying case files for victims of a particular serial killer I had worked on in the 1980s, as if someone had been reviewing the evidence overnight. The photograph that fell from a wall in the viewing room, landing face up in the center of the floor, showing a young woman who had died 10 years earlier, on the anniversary of her death. The phone that rang at 3 in the morning when I was alone in the building, and when I answered, I heard only breathing, slow and measured, before the line went dead. I documented these incidents privately, keeping notes that I never shared with colleagues, not because I believed they were supernatural, but because I wanted to understand them, to find rational explanations that I knew existed but could not quite reach. I told myself I was a scientist observing anomalies. I told myself I was maintaining intellectual curiosity. I told myself I was not afraid. But I was lying. I was afraid. Not of the dead, but of what their persistence in my awareness might mean about the nature of consciousness, about the boundaries between life and death, about the possibility that the clinical understanding I had built my career on was incomplete, that there were truths the morgue had been trying to teach me that I had been refusing to acknowledge. And then came the night with Thomas Whitmore. The night everything I had been carefully compartmentalizing, carefully explaining away, carefully denying, suddenly became unavoidable. After Thomas Whitmore spoke his wife's name and the name Sarah, after his eyes opened and looked at me with impossible awareness, after the laws of death and physiology bent and broke in that cold room, I did what any medical professional would do. I checked his vital signs again. I examined him thoroughly. I looked for any medical explanation that could account for what we had witnessed. There was none. His body was cold, refrigerated, 3 days post-mortem. His chest bore the sutured Y incision of autopsy. His organs had been removed, examined, and replaced. His blood had been drained and replaced with preservative fluids. There was no heartbeat, no respiration, no electrical activity in his brain that I could detect without equipment I did not have immediately available. By every measurable standard, Thomas Whitmore was dead, and yet he had moved, and yet he had spoken, and yet, for a moment that violated everything I understood, he had been present in a way that transcended the clinical definition of death. Eleanor stood beside the gurney, her hands still touching her husband's face, tears streaming down her cheeks, but her expression had changed. The grief was still there, profound and devastating, but now it was mixed with something else. Confusion, pain, a kind of betrayal that seemed to physically wound her. "Who is Sarah?" I asked gently, already suspecting the answer, already understanding that we were witnessing not just an impossible medical event but the revelation of a truth that had been buried for decades. Eleanor did not answer immediately. She stroked her husband's face, her fingers gentle despite the pain in her eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow, emptied of everything except a kind of terrible clarity. "I don't know," she said. "I've never heard that name. Not in 40 years of marriage. Not once." Catherine had returned to the room by then, having heard her mother's earlier gasp of shock. She stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes moving between her mother and her father's body and me, trying to understand what was happening, what had changed in the few minutes she had been gone. "Mom," she said, her voice uncertain. "What's going on? Why did you call out?" Eleanor turned to her daughter, and I saw the moment when she decided to tell the truth, to share what she had just witnessed, even though she knew it would sound impossible, even though she knew it would change everything. "Your father moved," Eleanor said simply. His eyes opened. He looked at me. And he spoke. Catherine's expression shifted from confusion to concern. I could see her thinking that her mother was having some kind of breakdown, that grief had overwhelmed her capacity to process reality. She looked at me, clearly expecting me to provide reassurance, to explain that this was a common misperception among the bereaved. But I could not do that, because I had seen it too. And more than that, I had felt it. In that moment when Thomas Whitmore's eye had tracked to my face, when I had felt seen by the dead, something had shifted in the room, in the air, in the space between what is possible and what is not. "I saw it as well," I said quietly, each word requiring effort, because admitting this felt like betraying my profession, my training, my entire understanding of the world. "I cannot explain it, but I witnessed movement. I witnessed what appeared to be consciousness." Catherine stared at me, her mouth slightly open, clearly unsure how to respond. In her face, I could see the conflict between respect for authority, her mother's testimony, and the rational impossibility of what we were claiming. "That's not possible," she said finally, her voice steady but strained. "Dad has been gone for 3 days. You performed an autopsy. You told us he was dead. People don't just come back." "I know," I said. "You're right. By every medical standard, your father is deceased. What we witnessed does not have a medical explanation." "Then what does it have?" Catherine asked, her voice rising slightly, emotion breaking through her attempt at composure. "What are you saying happened here?" I had no answer for her. I had spent 42 years in the morgue, and I had no framework for understanding what we had just experienced. But Eleanor, still standing beside her husband's body, still touching his face with a tenderness that seemed to transcend the shock she must have been feeling, spoke into the silence. "He was confessing," she said softly. "He was telling me something he never told me while he was alive. Something he kept secret for 40 years. He said Sarah's name. He said he was sorry." The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. I could hear the refrigeration units humming, that constant mechanical breathing that was the soundtrack to every moment I spent in this building. I could smell the formaldehyde, the cleaning solutions, the subtle scent of death that never fully went away no matter how thoroughly we cleaned. But beneath all of that, I could feel something else. Something that had no name. Something that felt like presence. "Did he say anything else?" I asked, knowing I was crossing professional boundaries, knowing I should be calling for assistance, for witnesses, for equipment to document what had occurred, but unable to do anything except try to understand. Eleanor shook her head slowly. "Just that. Just Sarah. Just I'm sorry." And then his eyes closed again. And he was gone. Really gone. I could feel it. The moment when he left again. She was right. I could feel it too. Whatever had animated Thomas Whitmore for those impossible seconds, whatever force or consciousness or inexplicable phenomenon had allowed him to speak, it had passed. The body on the gurney was still again, fully and finally at rest. The moment had ended, leaving only questions and the crushing weight of a secret revealed. Catherine moved closer to her mother, putting her arm around Eleanor's shoulders. "Mom, who is Sarah? Do you know? Has Dad ever mentioned that name?" "Never," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. Not once in 40 years. We've been married since 1969. We raised 3 children together. We bought a house, celebrated anniversaries, survived illness and loss and all the normal struggles of a marriage. And in all that time, he never mentioned anyone named Sarah. I watched Eleanor's face as she spoke, and I recognized the expression. I had seen it before on other family members in other viewing rooms, in other moments of revelation. It was the look of someone whose understanding of their entire life had just shifted, whose memories were being recontextualized in real time, whose foundation had cracked beneath them. There must be records, Catherine said, her voice taking on a practical tone, perhaps seeking refuge in logistics from the emotional storm. If Dad knew someone named Sarah, if she was important enough for him to mention her at the end, there must be some evidence. Letters, photographs, something. Eleanor was silent for a long moment, staring at her husband's still face. When she spoke again, her voice was distant, as if she were talking to herself rather than to us. He had a drawer in his study, she said slowly. He never let me open it. He said it was just old paperwork, tax returns, boring documents. I never pushed. I trusted him. Why would I not trust him? The question hung in the cold air, unanswerable and devastating. I felt a deep sadness settling over me, not just for Eleanor's loss, but for the betrayal that was layering on top of that loss, for the way death had not brought closure but had instead opened a door to questions that might never be answered. Mrs. Whitmore, I said gently, I understand this is overwhelming. What you witnessed, what we all witnessed, is beyond my professional experience. But I want you to know that you are not imagining this. Something extraordinary occurred here tonight. And whatever it means, whatever your husband was trying to tell you, you have every right to seek answers. She nodded slowly, but I could see that my words provided little comfort. How could they? Her husband had died 3 days ago. She had begun the process of grieving, of learning to live without him. And now, in this impossible moment, he had returned briefly, not to comfort her, not to offer peace, but to confess something that suggested their entire marriage might have been built on concealed truth. I helped them through the remaining protocols as gently as I could. I documented what had occurred, though my notes were careful, clinical, avoiding any definitive claims about what had happened. I could not write deceased subject exhibited signs of consciousness because that would be professional suicide. Instead, I noted that the family reported observing movements and that I observed what could have been post-mortem muscle contractions, though I knew this explanation was inadequate. Eleanor and Catherine left the morgue just after 9 in the evening. I walked them out through the corridors, past the administrative offices, to the front entrance where the night air felt warm compared to the refrigerated cold of the viewing room. Eleanor moved slowly, like someone in shock, and Catherine guided her carefully, one hand on her mother's elbow, providing physical support that could not address the emotional devastation. Before they left, Eleanor turned to me one final time. Her eyes were dry now, but the redness around them spoke of tears that would return, that would perhaps never fully stop. She looked at me with an expression I recognized, having seen it on the faces of dozens of families over the years. It was the look of someone seeking permission to feel what they felt, to believe what they had experienced, to trust their own senses in the face of impossible events. Dr. Webb, she said, her voice steady but quiet. What you saw tonight, what happened in that room, I need to know if you believe it was real. I need someone else to acknowledge it. Otherwise, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if I imagined it, if grief made me see things that weren't there. I looked at this small, elderly woman whose world had just shattered twice in the span of 3 days, and I made a decision that went against every professional instinct I had developed over 4 decades. I decided to tell the truth. I believe it was real, I said. I cannot explain it. I cannot provide a medical or scientific rationale for what occurred, but I witnessed it. Your husband moved. He spoke. And whatever that means, whatever explanation exists, you did not imagine it. I can bear witness to that. Relief flooded her face, so profound it was almost painful to witness. She nodded once, squeezed my hand briefly, and then turned and walked out into the night with her daughter. I watched them disappear into the parking lot, two figures becoming shadows, the living returning to their world while I remained in mine, the boundary keeper between the living and the dead, a role that had just become infinitely more complicated. I returned to the viewing room after they left. Thomas Whitmore's body was still on the gurney, still covered by the sheet I had arranged earlier, still at rest in a way that now felt different, heavier, weighted with the knowledge of what had briefly occurred. I stood beside the gurney for a long time, looking at his peaceful face, trying to understand what I had witnessed, trying to fit it into any framework of knowledge I possessed. I had seen many strange things in the morgue over the years. I had seen bodies that seemed to resist decomposition longer than they should. I had seen faces that appeared to change expression when viewed from different angles. I had heard sounds that could not be explained by building mechanics. But I had never seen anything like this. I had never seen the dead return, even briefly, to speak truth they had hidden in life. I thought about Eleanor, about the pain in her face when Thomas had spoken the name Sarah. I thought about 40 years of marriage, of shared meals and shared beds and shared children and shared life, all of it now cast into shadow by a confession made at the very edge of impossibility. What had Thomas Whitmore hidden? Who was Sarah? And why had he waited until death itself to finally tell the truth? These questions followed me through the rest of that night. I completed the documentation. I made the necessary phone calls. I arranged for the body to be transferred to the funeral home the following morning. I went through all the familiar motions of my profession, but underneath every action, I could feel something had changed. The morgue felt different. The air felt heavier. The silence seemed more attentive, as if the building itself was listening. Around midnight, I was alone in the administrative office, filling out paperwork, when I heard it. A sound from the viewing room. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. The sound of movement. Of fabric shifting. Of something or someone stirring in a room that should have been empty except for a body that could not possibly move again. I set down my pen carefully. My heart was beating faster, though I tried to tell myself it was just the refrigeration system, just the building settling, just my imagination working overtime after an emotionally exhausting evening. But I knew better. I had learned over the years to trust my instincts, to pay attention when something felt wrong, to investigate rather than ignore. I walked back down the corridor toward the viewing room. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly as I moved through the hallway, casting shadows that seemed to shift and breathe. The building was quiet around me, that deep silence that only exists in the early morning hours when the world has gone still and even the usual sounds of traffic and human activity have faded. I reached the viewing room door, which I had left slightly ajar. I paused outside, listening, my hand on the doorframe, my body poised between the impulse to enter and the instinct to retreat. I could hear something inside. Not movement now, but something else. A sound like breathing, slow and measured, though I knew that was impossible. Thomas Whitmore did not breathe. Thomas Whitmore was dead. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room looked exactly as I had left it. The gurney in the center, the body covered by a sheet, the fluorescent lights casting their harsh, even illumination. Nothing had changed. Nothing was out of place. And yet the air in the room felt different, charged, as if something had just occurred or was about to occur. I approached the gurney slowly. Thomas Whitmore's face was still peaceful, still settled into death's final expression. His eyes were closed. His features were motionless. There was no sign of the impossible consciousness I had witnessed earlier, no indication that anything unusual had happened or would happen again. But as I stood there, looking down at this man who had confessed a secret in death that he had kept in life, I felt something I had never felt before in 42 years of working among the dead. I felt as if I was being watched. Not by Thomas Whitmore, whose eyes were closed and whose consciousness, by all rational standards, no longer existed, but by something else. Some presence in the room that had no name, no visible form, no physical evidence of existence. I have never been a superstitious person. I have never believed in ghosts or spirits or any kind of supernatural phenomenon. My entire career has been built on empirical observation, on scientific methodology, on the principle that reality is what we can measure and verify. But in that moment, standing in the viewing room at midnight beside the body of a man who had spoken from death, I felt the boundaries of my understanding dissolve. I spoke into the quiet room, my voice low, addressing something I could not see and was not certain existed. "If you have something to say," I said, feeling foolish even as the words left my mouth, "if there is something unfinished, something that needs to be known, I am listening." The room remained silent. The refrigeration units hummed their constant song. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly. Nothing moved. Nothing spoke. But I stood there for several minutes anyway, waiting, open to whatever might occur, willing to witness whatever truth wanted to emerge from the shadows. Nothing happened. Eventually, I returned to the administrative office, completed my paperwork, and went home just before 2 in the morning, driving through the empty streets of Los Angeles with the sensation that I was carrying something heavy with me, something that had attached itself to me in that viewing room and was now following me out into the world. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in bed in my small apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the evening over and over in my mind, trying to find some rational explanation that I knew did not exist. I thought about Thomas Whitmore, about the secret he had carried for 40 years, about the moment when death had given him one final opportunity to tell the truth, and he had taken it. I thought about Eleanor, waking up in an empty bed, carrying not just grief but the painful knowledge that her husband had hidden something from her, something important enough to confess in the impossible moment between death and whatever comes after. And I thought about myself, about the career I had built, about the certainty I had cultivated, about the rational, empirical understanding of death that had just been challenged in a way I could not dismiss or explain away. Something had happened in that viewing room. Something real. Something that suggested the boundaries between life and death, between consciousness and absence, between truth and secrecy, were not as absolute as I had believed. The following morning, I arrived at the morgue earlier than usual, despite my lack of sleep. The building looked different in daylight, less ominous, more mundane. The corridors that had seemed to breathe with presence in the darkness now appeared ordinary, institutional, filled with the routine morning sounds of staff arriving, coffee brewing, phones beginning to ring. Thomas Whitmore's body had already been transferred to the funeral home. The viewing room was empty, the gurney stripped and cleaned, the space returned to its neutral state, ready for the next family, the next goodbye, the next accumulation of grief. I stood in the doorway looking at the empty room, trying to reconcile what had happened there the previous evening with the clinical ordinariness of the space and morning light. My colleague, Dr. Sarah Chen, found me there. Sarah was younger than I was, in her late 30s, brilliant and meticulous, someone who had joined the coroner's office 5 years earlier and had quickly become one of our most respected pathologists. She approached with a cup of coffee in hand, her expression curious. "Marcus," she said, her tone friendly but questioning. "You look terrible. Rough night?" I considered how much to tell her. Sarah was a scientist, a rationalist, someone who would likely view any account of what had occurred with the same skepticism I would have felt just 24 hours earlier. but I also valued her opinion, respected her judgment, and found myself wanting to share the burden of what I had witnessed. I had an unusual case last night, I said carefully. A final viewing that did not go as expected. Sarah's expression shifted to professional interest. Unusual how? I gestured toward the empty viewing room. The widow reported that the deceased moved, opened his eyes, spoke to her. Sarah's eyebrows rose. Post-mortem muscle contraction? Sometimes families misinterpret. I saw it too, I interrupted, the words coming out more forcefully than I intended. I was present. I observed movement. I observed what appeared to be consciousness. And before you suggest alternatives, I need you to know that this man had been dead for 3 days. He had been autopsied. There is no medical explanation for what occurred. Sarah was quiet for a moment, studying my face. I could see her processing what I had said, evaluating whether I was serious, whether I might be experiencing some kind of breakdown or exhaustion-induced hallucination. When she spoke again, her voice was careful, neutral. Marcus, that's not possible. You know that. Whatever you saw, whatever the family saw, there has to be a rational explanation. Bodies don't come back to consciousness 3 days post-mortem. They especially don't speak after autopsy. I know, I said, feeling suddenly exhausted, suddenly aware of how this conversation would play out, how my credibility would be questioned, how I would be viewed as unreliable, perhaps even unfit to continue working. I know it's not possible, but it happened, and I need to understand why. Sarah reached out and touched my arm gently, a gesture of concern rather than condescension. Have you been getting enough sleep? You've been working long hours. Maybe it's time to take a few days off, get some rest. I recognized the tone. It was the tone medical professionals use when they suspect a colleague is experiencing burnout or psychological distress. It was meant kindly, but it also signaled that she did not believe me, that she was already constructing an alternative narrative that fit within rational boundaries. I appreciate your concern, I said, keeping my voice even. But I know what I saw. I documented it in my notes. The family witnessed it as well. This is not exhaustion or hallucination. Sarah nodded slowly, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She did not argue further, perhaps recognizing that pushing me would be counterproductive. Instead, she changed the subject, asking about administrative matters, case assignments, routine work that filled our days. We spoke for a few more minutes, maintaining the professional cordiality that characterized our relationship, but something had shifted. I had revealed something that placed me outside the boundaries of acceptable medical discourse, and there was no way to take it back. After Sarah left, I spent the rest of the morning trying to focus on routine work. I had 3 autopsies scheduled, all straightforward cases, natural deaths that required documentation but no extensive investigation. I went through the familiar motions, making incisions, examining organs, collecting samples, dictating notes. But my mind kept returning to the viewing room, to Thomas Whitmore's impossible moment of consciousness, to the name Sarah and the secret it represented. During my lunch break, I did something I had never done before in my professional career. I searched for information about Thomas Whitmore beyond the medical records I had been provided. I accessed public records, obituary databases, anything that might tell me more about this man who had spoken from death. What I found was unremarkable. Thomas Whitmore, aged 73, married to Eleanor for 40 years, father of 3 children, grandfather of 6. He had worked as an accountant for most of his career, retiring 10 years earlier. He had lived in the same house in Pasadena for 35 years. He had no criminal record, no scandals in his past, nothing that suggested any kind of hidden life or secret relationship. But the name Sarah haunted me. Who was she? What had been her relationship to Thomas? And why had he kept her existence secret from his wife for 4 decades? These questions felt important not just because they related to an extraordinary event I had witnessed, but because they seemed to point towards something larger, something about the nature of truth and secrecy, about the things we hide and the moments when those hidden things finally demand to be acknowledged. I found myself thinking about Eleanor, wondering if she had gone home and opened that locked drawer in her husband's study, wondering what she might have found there, whether there were letters or photographs or some other evidence of Sarah's existence. I had no right to that information. My professional relationship with the Whitmore family had ended when the body was released. But I could not stop thinking about it, could not stop feeling that I had witnessed the beginning of something, a revelation that was still unfolding, a truth that was still emerging from decades of concealment. 3 days later, I received a phone call that I had not expected. It was Catherine, Eleanor's daughter, her voice hesitant but determined. She asked if I had time to meet with her and her mother, saying there was something they needed to discuss with me, something related to what had happened in the viewing room. I agreed immediately, my curiosity overriding any professional hesitation I might have felt. We met at a small cafe near the coroner's office, a quiet place with comfortable chairs and soft lighting, far removed from the clinical environment where we had first encountered each other. Eleanor looked thinner than I remembered, as if grief had physically diminished her in the days since I had last seen her. Catherine sat close to her mother, protective, her hand resting on Eleanor's arm. Eleanor spoke first, her voice quiet but steady. "Dr. Webb, I want to thank you for meeting with us. I know you have no obligation to us now that my husband's body has been released, but I need to tell you what we found. I need someone to know." I leaned forward, giving her my full attention. "Of course. Please." Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a small bundle of letters, old envelopes yellowed with age, the paper soft from decades of handling. She placed them carefully on the table between us, her fingers lingering on them as if she was reluctant to let them go. "The locked drawer," she said. "Catherine and I opened it the day after we saw you. These were inside. Letters. Dozens of them. All from a woman named Sarah Harmon. Written between 1968 and 1973. I looked at the letters, at the careful handwriting visible through the transparent top envelope, at the old stamps and postmarks that spoke of correspondence from more than 40 years ago. I felt my heart rate increase, that familiar sensation of approaching some truth that had been hidden, some story that wanted to be known. "May I?" I asked, gesturing toward the letters. Eleanor nodded. "Please. I want you to read them. I want you to understand what my husband kept from me, what he was apologizing for in that impossible moment." I picked up the top letter carefully, unfolded the aged paper, and began to read. The handwriting was elegant, careful, the script of someone who had been taught penmanship in a different era. The letter was dated January 1968, addressed to Tom, written in language that was both formal and intimate, the voice of someone who knew the recipient deeply but was maintaining some distance, some boundary of propriety. "Dear Tom, I received your letter and I understand your decision. I cannot say it does not hurt, because it does, more than I can adequately express. But I also understand your reasoning and I respect your choice. You have always been honest with me, and that honesty, even when painful, is something I treasure. You spoke of responsibility, of the life you have chosen, of the family you wish to build. I know you mean these things sincerely. You are a good man, Tom. That is something I have always known, even in these circumstances that have been so difficult for both of us. I will not write again after this unless you wish me to. I will carry what we shared in silence, as a memory that belongs only to us. But know that my feelings have not changed, will not change, regardless of geography or time or the choices we must make. Be well, Tom." Be happy. Live the life you have chosen fully and without regret. Yours always, Sarah. I read the letter twice, feeling the weight of the words, the careful emotion contained in each sentence. Then I looked up at Eleanor, whose face showed a complicated mixture of pain and something else, something like understanding. There are 32 letters in total, Catherine said quietly. They span 5 years. They tell a story. What story? I asked, though I was already beginning to understand, already seeing the outlines of what Thomas Whitmore had hidden, what he had carried for 40 years before finally confessing in that impossible moment between death and whatever comes after. Eleanor's voice was soft when she answered, but there was strength in it, the strength of someone who had processed shock and was now seeking understanding. Sarah was his first love. They met in college, before he met me. They were together for 3 years. Engaged, even. But Sarah's family moved to England in 1967. Her father's job transferred him. She went with them. And Tom had to decide whether to follow her or stay and build his life here. He stayed, I said, already knowing the answer. He stayed, Eleanor confirmed. And 6 months later, he met me. We married quickly. I thought it was romantic that he fell in love with me so intensely. But now I understand. He was trying to move forward. He was trying to make a choice and commit to it fully. I looked down at the letters again, and Sarah kept writing to him. For 5 years, Catherine said. Long after he married Mom. Long after he made it clear he had chosen a different path. She kept writing, not trying to win him back. Just maintaining contact. Expressing feelings that clearly never faded. Eleanor reached across the table and touched the letters gently. The last one is dated December 1973. In it, she tells him she's getting married, moving on with her life. She wishes him well, and she asks him to destroy the letters, to let their shared past finally rest. But he kept them, I said. He kept them, Eleanor agreed. Hidden in a locked drawer for 42 years. Never mentioned. Never acknowledged. A secret life that existed parallel to our marriage, known only to him. The cafe around us seemed to fade, the quiet conversation of other patrons becoming background noise, the world narrowing to just the 3 of us and these old letters that contained a story of love and choice and the things we carry in silence. How do you feel about this? I asked Eleanor, knowing it was a personal question, knowing I had no professional standing to ask it, but feeling that the extraordinary circumstances of how this truth had emerged gave me some right to know. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her fingers still touching the letters, her face thoughtful. When she spoke, her voice carried a complexity I had not expected. I'm angry, she said. I'm hurt. I feel betrayed that he kept this from me for our entire marriage. But I'm also... She paused, searching for the right word. I'm also grateful, because I think I understand now why he came back. Why he spoke in that impossible moment. He had carried this secret alone for so long, and at the very end, he needed me to know. He needed to confess. He needed to apologize not just for the secret but for the burden of carrying it alone. Catherine squeezed her mother's arm gently. Mom has been incredibly strong about this. I've had no choice, Eleanor said with a sad smile. Falling apart would not change anything. And the truth is, Tom was a good husband. A good father. He gave me 40 years of love and partnership and shared life. Whatever he felt for Sarah, whatever he kept hidden, it did not prevent him from building a real life with me. And maybe that's what his apology was about. Not that he loved her, but that he never told me, never gave me the chance to know and understand and accept that part of his history. I looked at this small, elderly woman who had lost her husband twice in the span of a week, once to death and once to the revelation of a secret, and I felt a profound respect for her capacity to find grace in the midst of pain. Why did you want to share this with me? I asked. Eleanor met my eyes steadily. Because you witnessed something extraordinary. Something impossible. And I wanted you to know that it meant something. That Tom did not come back for nothing. He came back to tell a truth he could never tell while alive. And I wanted you to know that truth, to understand what you witnessed. We sat together for another hour, Eleanor and Catherine showing me more of the letters, telling me stories about Tom, about their life together, about the good man he had been despite the secret he carried. I listened carefully, honored to be trusted with this private history, grateful to understand the context of what I had witnessed in that viewing room. When we finally parted, Eleanor gave me a final message. Dr. Webb, thank you for believing us. Thank you for acknowledging that what happened was real. It would have been easy for you to dismiss it, to protect your professional reputation by calling it hallucination or grief-induced delusion. But you didn't. You gave us the gift of validation, and I want you to know that it matters. I watched them leave the cafe, two figures walking out into the afternoon sunlight, carrying their grief and their newfound knowledge, learning to live with the complicated truth of a man who had loved them both while hiding a part of himself they had never known existed. And I sat alone at the table, thinking about Thomas Whitmore, about his impossible moment of consciousness, about the secret he had carried for 40 years before finally, at the very edge of forever, finding the courage or the necessity to confess. I thought about what it meant that death had given him that opportunity, that the boundary between life and what comes after had momentarily dissolved to allow truth to emerge. The weeks following my meeting with Eleanor and Catherine were strange ones. I continued my work at the morgue, conducting autopsies, filing reports, maintaining the routine that had sustained me for decades. But something had fundamentally changed in how I experienced that work. The bodies I examined no longer seemed quite as inert, quite as finished. I found myself wondering about the secrets they carried, about the truths they had never told, about the confessions that might have been made if they had been given one impossible moment like Thomas Whitmore had received. I began paying more attention to the families who came for viewings, listening more carefully to what they said during those final goodbyes. I heard wives apologizing to dead husbands for things unsaid. I heard children seeking forgiveness from parents who could no longer respond. I heard the whispered confessions that people make when they believe they are speaking to someone who has moved beyond the capacity to judge or forgive. And I started to understand something about the morgue that I had missed during all my years of clinical practice. It was not just a place where bodies were processed and examined. It was a place where truth accumulated, where the lies of life met the honesty of death, where secrets that had been carefully maintained in the world of the living were laid bare in the cold room where pretense no longer served any purpose. I thought often about Sarah Harmon, about the woman whose name Thomas Whitmore had spoken from death. I wondered where she was now, whether she was still alive, whether she ever thought about the young man she had loved in college who had chosen a different life. I wondered if she had kept her own set of letters, her own private archive of a love that had existed briefly before being subsumed by the practical demands of adult life. I did something I had never done before. I searched for Sarah Harmon in public records, using the information from the letters Eleanor had shown me. It took several days, but eventually I found her. She had married in 1974, just as her last letter had indicated. She had lived in England for most of her adult life, and she had died in 2007 at the age of 62 of breast cancer. I sat with that knowledge for a long time. Sarah Harmon had been gone for 2 years when Thomas Whitmore died. She had never known about his impossible moment of confession, about the fact that her name had been the truth he finally spoke. Whatever connection they had shared, whatever love had persisted through decades and distance and separate lives, it had ended with her death, years before his. But somehow, the revelation of her existence, the confession of her name, had felt necessary. Thomas Whitmore had carried her in secret for 4 years, and at the end, he had needed Eleanor to know. Not to hurt her, not to diminish their marriage, but to acknowledge that the heart is large enough to hold multiple truths, multiple loves, multiple stories that exist simultaneously even when they cannot be spoken aloud. This understanding changed something in me. I began to see my work differently, to see the dead not just as subjects for examination but as carriers of complex histories that deserve respect and attention. I started spending more time with families, asking questions about the deceased, learning their stories, understanding the context of their lives. Not because it was medically necessary, but because it felt important to honor the fullness of who they had been. My colleagues noticed the change. Sarah Chin commented that I seemed different, more contemplative, more emotionally engaged with the work. Others asked if I was all right, if something was troubling me. I assured them I was fine, that I was simply reconsidering my approach after decades of practice, trying to bring more humanity to a profession that necessarily involved clinical detachment. But the truth was more complicated. The truth was that Thomas Whitmore's impossible confession had cracked something open in me, had revealed that the boundaries I had carefully maintained between the living and the dead, between the rational and the inexplicable, between the clinical and the emotional, were not as absolute as I had believed. And I was trying to navigate a new understanding of my work, of death itself, of the strange spaces where consciousness and matter and meaning intersect in ways that science cannot fully explain. It was 6 months after Thomas Whitmore's death when I experienced something that convinced me the morgue was trying to teach me something I was still struggling to understand. I was working late one evening, as was my habit, conducting an autopsy on an elderly woman who had died of complications from pneumonia. The case was straightforward, requiring only standard procedures and documentation. The morgue was empty except for me. The other staff had gone home hours earlier. The building was quiet, filled only with the familiar sounds of refrigeration units and the occasional creak of old infrastructure settling. I had the radio on low, playing classical music, something I often did to fill the silence during long procedures. I was closing the Y incision, suturing carefully, when I heard a sound from the corridor outside the examination room. Footsteps. Slow, measured, deliberate. The sound of someone walking through the hallway with purpose. I paused, my hands still holding the needle and thread. The building should have been empty. Security made rounds periodically, but they were not due for another hour. I listened carefully, tracking the footsteps as they moved down the corridor, coming closer to the examination room. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I waited, expecting a knock, expecting someone to enter. But there was only silence. I set down my instruments carefully and walked to the door, opening it to see who was there. The corridor was empty. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting their harsh illumination on tile floors that showed no evidence of recent passage. There was no one there. No security guard. No colleague who might have returned for forgotten items. No one. I stepped out into the corridor, looking both ways, listening for any sound of movement or presence. Nothing. The building was as empty as it had been moments before. The footsteps I had heard so clearly, so unmistakably, had no physical source. I stood in the corridor for several minutes, my heart beating faster than it should, my rational mind offering explanations that my instincts rejected. It was not the building settling. It was not pipes expanding or contracting. It was not my imagination. I had heard footsteps. Clear, deliberate, human footsteps in a space where no human walked. I returned to the examination room, to the body of the elderly woman on my table, and finished my work with hands that were slightly unsteady. As I sutured, I found myself speaking aloud to the empty room, my voice quiet but firm. "I don't know if you're here," I said, addressing whatever presence or consciousness or inexplicable phenomenon inhabited this space. I don't know if the dead linger or if these sounds are just the building's way of reminding me of all the deaths it has witnessed. But if you are here, if you have something to say, if there is some truth you need acknowledged, I am listening. I have been listening since Thomas Whitmore spoke his wife's name. I am trying to understand what you need me to know. The room remained silent. The classical music played softly from the radio. The refrigeration units hummed their constant song. Nothing moved. Nothing spoke. But I felt, in that moment, that something had heard me. That my acknowledgement of presence, of possibility, of truth beyond the empirical, had been received. I finished the autopsy, completed my documentation, and left the morgue around midnight. As I walked through the empty corridors toward the exit, I felt the weight of the building around me, the accumulation of deaths and grief and secrets that had soaked into these walls over decades of operation. And I understood that I was not just a medical examiner documenting physical evidence. I was also a witness to something larger, something that existed in the spaces between life and death, between truth and secrecy, between what we can explain and what simply is. The footsteps followed me occasionally after that night. Never frequent, never predictable, but recurring with enough regularity that I came to expect them. Sometimes I would hear them in corridors. Sometimes they would pause outside examination rooms where I worked. Once, I heard them in the viewing room where Thomas Whitmore had spoken from death, soft steps that circled the space where his gurney had been before fading into silence. I stopped trying to find rational explanations. I stopped looking for sources or dismissing the experiences as hallucination or exhaustion. I simply accepted that the morgue was inhabited by more than just the physical bodies we examined. It was inhabited by presence, by memory, by the accumulated weight of all the stories that had passed through this space. And I learned to work alongside that presence, to acknowledge it without fear, to remain open to whatever truths it might reveal. My colleagues never knew about these experiences. I did not share them, recognizing that they would not be believed, that they would raise questions about my fitness to continue working. But I carried them privately, adding them to the growing collection of inexplicable moments that had begun with Thomas Whitmore's confession and continued to accumulate as I moved through the final years of my career. I thought often about what Sarah Chin had said when I first told her about Thomas Whitmore's impossible moment of consciousness. She had suggested that I was exhausted, that I needed rest, that there had to be a rational explanation for what I had witnessed. And I understood her response. It was the response I would have given just a few months earlier, before my understanding of death and consciousness and truth had been fundamentally challenged. But I also knew that some experiences cannot be explained away, cannot be dismissed as hallucination or delusion or fatigue. Some experiences demand to be acknowledged as real, even when they violate every principle of scientific understanding. And Thomas Whitmore's confession, his impossible moment of consciousness 3 days after death, was one of those experiences. I had witnessed it. Eleanor had witnessed it. The truth of Sarah's existence, hidden for 4 years, had emerged in that moment. And whatever had allowed that emergence, whatever force or consciousness or inexplicable phenomenon had briefly animated Thomas Whitmore's dead body to speak one final truth, it was real in a way that transcended medical explanation. I retired from the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office in 2015 after 42 years of practice. The decision was not difficult. I was 67 years old, tired in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion, ready to step away from the constant proximity to death that had defined my adult life. But I also knew that I was not truly leaving. The morgue would follow me. The experiences I had accumulated, the truths I had witnessed, the impossible moments that had challenged everything I thought I understood, they would remain part of me regardless of where I went or how I spent my remaining years. My last week at the morgue was filled with goodbyes, retirement parties, the standard rituals of professional departure. Colleagues spoke kindly about my years of service, about my dedication, about the thousands of cases I had handled with skill and care. They gave me a plaque, a watch, a collection of photographs showing me at various stages of my career. They told me I would be missed, but none of them knew about the other work I had been doing in those final years. The quiet listening, the acknowledgement of presence, the willingness to witness truths that existed beyond the empirical. That work was private, personal, something I carried alone as I had carried so many other burdens throughout my career. On my final night, I walked through the empty morgue one last time. I visited each examination room, each storage area, each corridor that had been my daily landscape for decades. I touched the cold metal tables where I had conducted thousands of autopsies. I stood in the viewing room where Thomas Whitmore had spoken his impossible confession. I listened to the familiar sounds of refrigeration units, of fluorescent lights buzzing, of old pipes creaking as the building settled into night. And I spoke aloud to whatever presence inhabited this space, my voice quiet but clear in the empty building. "Thank you," I said. "Thank you for teaching me that death is not the end of truth. That secrets demand to be told, even if the telling requires the impossible. That consciousness and presence exist in forms we cannot fully understand or measure. I am leaving this place, but I will carry what you have shown me. I will honor the truths you have revealed." The building was silent in response, but I felt something shift in the air, some acknowledgement of my words. Perhaps it was only my imagination, my mind creating meaning in the absence of empirical evidence. But I chose to believe it was real, that my years of witness had been recognized, that the dead I had cared for in this place understood that I had finally learned to see them not just as subjects for examination, but as carriers of stories that deserve respect and attention. I left the morgue that night and did not look back. I drove home through the dark streets of Los Angeles, feeling lighter than I had in years, feeling that I had completed something important, that I had moved from one phase of understanding to another. But retirement did not bring the distance I expected. The morgue followed me into my new life in ways both subtle and profound. I dreamed of it frequently, long dreams that were not nightmares but memories, replaying cases I had handled, families I had met, moments of revelation that had changed my understanding. I heard the footsteps sometimes in my apartment, soft and measured, as if someone was walking through rooms that should be empty. I smelled formaldehyde occasionally, that distinctive chemical scent that had been the constant background of my professional life, appearing suddenly and without apparent source before fading again. These experiences did not frighten me. They felt natural, expected, a continuation of the connection I had developed with the space where I had spent so many years. The dead, I had learned, do not respect the boundaries we try to establish between work and home, between professional life and personal life, between then and now. They persist in memory, in dreams, in the occasional inexplicable moment when the veil between worlds becomes thin enough to allow communication. 6 months into retirement, I received a letter that surprised me. It was from Catherine, Eleanor Whitmore's daughter, written in careful script on good paper. She wrote to tell me that Eleanor had died peacefully in her sleep 2 weeks earlier, at the age of 78. She had been in good health, no warning, no prior illness. Just a quiet ending that came in the night, taking her from the world with the same gentleness that had characterized her response to her husband's impossible confession. Catherine wrote that she had found something among her mother's possessions that she thought I should see. She asked if she could visit me, if I would be willing to meet with her one more time. I agreed immediately, curious about what Eleanor might have left behind, what final truth might be waiting to emerge. We met at the same cafe where we had gathered years earlier, when Eleanor had shown me the letters from Sarah Harmon. Catherine looked older, more worn, grief adding years to her features. But she also seemed at peace, carrying her mother's death with a grace that suggested she understood it was time. She placed a journal on the table between us, old and worn, its cover faded with age. "I found this among Mom's things," she said. She had been writing in it since the night Dad spoke to her in the morgue. She never told anyone about it, not even me. But she left a note saying that if anything happened to her, I should make sure you saw it. I opened the journal carefully, respectful of its age and the intimacy of its contents. The pages were filled with Eleanor's neat handwriting, entries dated from the night of Thomas Whitmore's confession forward through the years until just a week before her death. The entries told a story I had not known, a story of Eleanor's journey from betrayal and pain to understanding and forgiveness. She wrote about opening the locked drawer, finding the letters, learning about Sarah Harmon. She wrote about the anger she felt, the sense of betrayal, the way her entire marriage suddenly seemed questionable. But she also wrote about the gradual shift in her understanding, about realizing that Thomas had been a good husband despite the secret he carried, about understanding that the heart is large enough to hold multiple truths simultaneously, about recognizing that his confession in that impossible moment was not meant to hurt her but to free both of them from the burden of secrecy. She wrote about forgiving him, a process that took months, that required her to re-examine every memory of their marriage, to see him not as someone who had betrayed her but as someone who had carried a complicated truth with as much grace as he could manage. She wrote about coming to see his confession as a gift, a final honesty that allowed her to know him fully, completely, without the filter of secrets that had existed between them. And she wrote about dreams she had been having since his death. Dreams where Thomas appeared to her, not to apologize again but to simply be present, to remind her that love transcends death, that the bond they had shared continued even after his body had been returned to the earth. She wrote about these dreams with wonder, with gratitude, with a certainty that they were real communications rather than products of grief. The final entry, dated a week before her death, was brief but powerful. "I dreamed of Tom again last night. He was young, the way he looked when we first met. He smiled at me and said it was almost time, that he had been waiting, that we would be together soon. When I woke, I was not afraid. I felt peaceful. I think I finally understand what he was trying to tell me in that impossible moment at the morgue. He was not just confessing a secret. He was preparing me. He was showing me that death is not an ending but a transformation, that consciousness persists, that love continues. I am ready now, ready to join him, ready to see what comes next. And I am grateful for every moment of our complicated, beautiful, imperfect life together." I closed the journal carefully, feeling tears in my eyes for the first time in many years. I looked at Catherine, who was watching me with quiet understanding. "She died peacefully," Catherine said softly. "In her sleep, just like she wrote. And when we found her, she was smiling. I had never seen her smile like that, so peaceful, so content. It was as if she had gone somewhere she wanted to be." We sat together in silence for a while, honoring Eleanor's memory, acknowledging the strange and beautiful journey she had taken from betrayal to forgiveness to a kind of transcendent understanding that most people never reach. "Why did she want me to see this?" I asked finally. Catherine smiled slightly. "She wrote a note. She said you were the only person who would understand, who would believe that Dad's confession was real, that her dreams were real, that death is not what we think it is. She said you had witnessed something extraordinary, and she wanted you to know that it led somewhere, that it meant something, that it changed her in ways that made her final years richer and deeper than they might have been otherwise." I thought about Thomas Whitmore, about his impossible moment of consciousness, about the confession that had shattered and then healed his wife's understanding of their marriage. I thought about Eleanor's journey from pain to peace, about her dreams of reunion, about the smile Catherine described finding on her face in death. And I understood that what I had witnessed in that viewing room was not just an anomaly, not just an inexplicable medical event, but the beginning of a story about love and truth and the persistence of consciousness beyond the boundaries we try to impose on it. "Thank you for sharing this with me," I said to Catherine. "Your mother's journey, her understanding, her forgiveness, it's one of the most profound things I've encountered. And I'm honored that she trusted me with it." Catherine nodded. "She said you would understand. She said that what happened in that morgue changed all three of us, her, me, and you. And she was right. I don't see death the same way anymore. I don't think of it as an ending. I think of it as a transition, a doorway to something we can't fully comprehend but can trust is real." We spoke for another hour, sharing memories of Eleanor, discussing the strange path that had led from Thomas Whitmore's confession to Eleanor's peaceful death and beyond. When we finally parted, Catherine gave me the journal, saying her mother had wanted me to have it, to keep it as evidence of the transformation that had occurred. I carried that journal home with me and read it again that night, slowly, carefully, absorbing every word. Eleanor's voice came through clearly in the entries, honest and searching, moving from pain to understanding with a courage that humbled me. And I recognized something in her writing that resonated deeply with my own experience. She had been changed by the impossible, by the inexplicable, by the moment when the boundaries between life and death had briefly dissolved. Just as I had been changed. Just as anyone who truly witnesses the extraordinary must be changed. The years since Eleanor's death have been quiet ones. I lived simply in retirement, reading, writing occasional articles for medical journals, maintaining contact with former colleagues. But my understanding of death, of consciousness, of the strange spaces where truth and mystery intersect, continues to evolve. I have learned to trust the inexplicable. The footsteps I hear in my apartment do not frighten me anymore. They feel like companionship, like the presence of all the dead I cared for during my career, checking in, reminding me that I am not alone. The dreams I have of the morgue are not disturbing but informative, showing me cases I handled, teaching me things I missed while I was focused on clinical documentation. And I have come to understand something that I wish I had known earlier in my career. Death is not the enemy. It is not the opposite of life, but a continuation of it, a transformation rather than a termination. The consciousness that animates us, that makes us who we are, does not simply cease when the heart stops beating. It persists in ways we cannot fully measure or understand, but which occasionally become visible in moments of extraordinary circumstance. Thomas Whitmore's confession was one of those moments. A crack in the fabric of normal reality that allowed truth to emerge, that gave consciousness one final opportunity to speak, that demonstrated that the boundary between life and death is more permeable than we typically acknowledge. I think about him often, this man I never met while he was alive, but who taught me more about death than 4 decades of medical practice had taught me. I think about his decision to keep Sarah Harmon's existence secret for 40 years, about the weight of that secret, about the way it must have shaped his life even as he built a genuine, loving marriage with Eleanor. And I think about his final choice, if it can be called a choice, to return briefly from death to confess that secret, to speak Sarah's name, to apologize for the burden of concealment. Whatever force or consciousness or inexplicable phenomenon allowed that return, it served a purpose. It gave Eleanor information she needed to complete her understanding of their marriage. It initiated a journey from betrayal to forgiveness that transformed her final years. It demonstrated to me that truth demands to be acknowledged, even when that acknowledgement requires the impossible. I have written this account not to convince anyone of anything, but simply to document what I witnessed, what I learned, what changed in me during those years at the morgue and the years since. I know that many will read this with skepticism, with the same rational dismissal I would have offered before Thomas Whitmore spoke from death. I know that medical colleagues will attribute my experiences to exhaustion, hallucination, the psychological effects of spending too many years surrounded by death. But I also know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. And I know that truth does not require universal belief to remain true. The dead spoke to me in that viewing room. The morgue taught me about persistence of consciousness. Eleanor Whitmore's journal showed me that transformation is possible even in the face of profound pain and betrayal. These truths are mine to carry, regardless of whether anyone else acknowledges them. And I carry them gratefully, understanding that I was given a rare gift, the opportunity to witness something extraordinary, to have my understanding fundamentally challenged, to learn that reality is larger and stranger and more mysterious than my profession had taught me to believe. I am 67 years old now, approaching the end of my own life, though I hope I still have years ahead of me. But I am no longer afraid of death the way I once was. I have spent too much time with it, seen too much evidence of its continuity rather than its finality, to fear it as an ending. When my time comes, I hope I will face it with the same courage Eleanor showed, with the same peaceful smile Catherine described finding on her mother's face. I hope that whatever secrets I have carried, whatever truths I have not spoken, will find their moment of emergence, their opportunity to be acknowledged before I fully transition from this world to whatever comes next. And I hope that somewhere, in the space between life and death, Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore are together again, their complicated, beautiful, imperfect love continuing in a form that transcends the limitations of flesh and time. I hope that Sarah Harmon, who died years before Thomas but who remained present in his heart until the very end, has found her own peace, her own continuation, her own place in the vast mystery of what lies beyond death. Because what happened that night in the viewing room taught me something essential. It taught me that love persists. That truth demands acknowledgement. That consciousness is not confined to the living. And that death, despite everything we fear about it, is not the final word. The morgue still calls to me sometimes. I drive past the Los Angeles County Coroner's office occasionally, seeing the building where I spent so many years, where I witnessed so much death and grief and occasional transcendence. And I feel grateful for those years, for the lessons learned, for the impossible moments that changed everything I thought I understood. I have been a witness to the extraordinary. I have stood at the boundary between life and death and seen that boundary dissolve. I have heard the dead speak truth. And I have learned that our clinical understanding of death, our scientific certainty about the cessation of consciousness, is incomplete. There is more. There is always more. And the morgue, that cold, clinical space where bodies are examined and documented, is also a place where mysteries accumulate, where truth refuses to stay buried, where the dead sometimes return to speak what they could not speak in life. This is what I know. This is what I witnessed. This is what Thomas Whitmore taught me when he opened his eyes 3 days after death and whispered a name his wife had never heard, setting in motion a transformation that would continue long after his body had been returned to the earth. The dead do not always rest quietly. Sometimes they return. Sometimes they speak. Sometimes they shatter our comfortable certainties about the nature of consciousness and death and truth. And when they do, when they crack open the boundary between worlds and allow something impossible to emerge, the only appropriate response is to bear witness, to acknowledge, to carry their truth forward into the world of the living. This is what I have done. This is what I continue to do. This is what I will do until my own death arrives and I discover for myself what Thomas and Eleanor already know, that death is not an ending but a doorway, not a cessation but a continuation, not the final word but simply the beginning of a different conversation. Because what happened that night, in that viewing room, with that impossible confession, came back to me in dreams and memories and inexplicable moments. It followed me into retirement. It shaped my understanding of everything that came after. And it taught me the most important lesson of my 42 years as a medical examiner, that the dead are not silent, that truth cannot be buried forever, and that love, in all its complicated forms, persists beyond the boundaries we try to impose on it. This is their story. This is my story. This is the truth that emerged from death and demanded to be told.